Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back on the program Hassan Ben Imran, who's a legal advisor at Law for Palestine and a PhD researcher in law at the University of Galway, Ireland. Hassan, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Ellie.
So I want to start with a recent article that was posted on February 3rd at the Palestine Chronicle by Ronnie Casserills, who's a veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the former Minister for Intelligence Services. He writes, "The formation of the Hague Group marks a turning point in the global struggle to hold Israel accountable for its crimes in Palestine." And here he's talking about the announcement on January 31st of this year that 9 nations in the global south, of course, Belize, Bolivia, Cuba, Colombia, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa are committed to coordinated legal, economic, and diplomatic measures against Israel. So I was wondering, starting with this, can you talk about what those measures are and the weight of this? Like, how important is a move like this?
Yeah. I think this is absolutely a great development. In the least, it's a development in the right directions. The ICJ, in its latest advisory opinion, did talk about the state obligations, how they should act, did talk about the UN obligations. However, it left it to the states and to the United Nations to develop these modalities for how to move forward from the advisory opinion that established that Israel's occupation in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal in and of itself. So the obligations were very clear that the states should not recognize the status quo, should cease to have any military or economic or different relations that would contribute to the illegality of the situation. So now the ball, as we say it, is in the court of the states. This came, I think, as a response to that, to support, first of all, the international institutions that are being directly attacked by different countries, different politicians that are not happy about the operation of international justice when it comes to their shores and it comes to their own territory and their own leaders. So this is a good development. However, time will tell us about the practical element of that. Does it mean that it's gonna simply support the institutions and the courts in terms of statements, supporting them with statements, or it will be translated into actual litigation, actual cases in their own domestic courts? So will we hear that these group of countries will be prosecuting Israeli soldiers and Israeli leaders in their own jurisdictions? Because this is a possibility. This is something that can happen, that should happen. Will it be reflected in their trade relations with Israel? Will it be reflected in the boycott agenda? Will it be reflected in also pushing for unseating Israel from the United Nations? One of the very commonsensical conclusions that anyone would draw from a state that publicly attacks the UN, bans the UN staff from entering its own territory or the territories that occupied, and tries to dismantle one of the oldest agencies of the United Nations, which is the UN UNRWA. It publicly disrespects and attacks the Secretary General of the organization, the chief of the organization, the chief officer, I would say. So it's a commonsensical conclusion to push for unseating that state, or at least suspending the access of its own diplomats to the buildings of the United Nations. So will this be translated into actual pressure through these measures? That's something that we will tell. But the very creation of this group is a great thing. Another point I wanted to mention about this group, besides the measures, the composition of the group. While it is really great to see the global south uniting again to push for the advancement of justice, it's inexplicable why there is not a single Western country. I mean, in short, like, I mean, there are many countries that have. Okay, it's like it's the Hague is in the West. The Hague is in the Netherlands. The Hague is not in Kuala Lumpur. The Hague is not in Johannesburg. The Hague is not in here. The courts are there. So it will be great to have countries representation from different parts of the world. I would be very happy to have Ireland join that group as well. Spain, that has taken some steps, Belgium, others. Uh, talking about caring for international justice is easy, but when it comes to practical steps, only then we know who actually means it. So this is a chance to actually prove that this is something of concern. If not the measures, at least the protection of the international institutions that were established after a world war that we don't want to repeat, I guess. So it makes total sense to question why certain blocks of states have not joined this effort, but it's not over. I hope that this will change soon enough.
Yeah, I mean and we've talked about this too, the colonial court aspect, and that it's it seems to be a weapon that's pointed towards the global south as opposed to inward. And indeed, the U.S. even has the Hague Invasion Act, which literally says that the U.S. will invade the Netherlands if the Netherlands tries to take an American or even an American ally to the court, which yeah, is pretty amazing. And in fact, the on January 9th of this year, the House of Representatives passed, quote, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, which seeks to impose sanctions on individuals associated with the ICC who pursue investigations or prosecutions against U.S. citizens or those of allied nations, such as Israel. And that bill has now gone to the Senate. And so that's on top of the Hague Invasion Act. And so I want to ask you here, I mean, it seems like international law is a bit like that argument that ghosts are only scary if you believe in them. Like international law is only scary if you believe it's a thing. I mean, like if you can just choose to opt out of international law, like what power is there in international law if states like Israel and the United States can just say, I don't believe in it, it doesn't apply?
That's one of the most existential questions about international law and within international law. On one hand, everyone wants to have a moral set of do's and don'ts, things that should happen in a certain way and shouldn't happen in a certain way, and have everyone agree to it. And hence, the regime of international law was developed early on from IHL, like the wars that happened that led to the creation of international humanitarian law, so on and so forth. On the other hand, the law was created, at least that's how many states saw it, was created on the premise that it is something that would make us look good, but it wouldn't prevent us from pursuing our national interests. So the moment this clash happens, you will see that the rift happens between the two. International law in its current format, at least the regime of the UN and the related conventions and institutions, developed after the Second World War. It was evolving on the basis of many other events, but the Second World War created this regime of international law as we know it today. And it kept evolving, but the foundation was made then. So it was a point of let's say, where everyone agreed, okay, we're tired, we don't want this anymore. Let's create these regulations that would regulate our own state of nature, as Hobbes calls it, the ugly side of humans trying to annihilate each other. So we create these institutions and we will live in a peaceful world. And that was fine for many states until they realized that these regulations are slowing them down. It's the US thought it never needs to drop another atomic bomb on Japan. So, okay, we ban it. Like we don't have to do it anymore. But now then they realized some of their allies need to do that to settle some business, right? The US needed to settle its business in Japan in the easiest way possible, and just Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. Netanyahu specifically mentioned this to Biden. First, it was some journalists covering that, and then President Biden himself went on TV after when he was I think that was a month ago, and he started talking about that conversation that happened between him and the Israeli Prime Minister. Netanyahu was telling Biden that Biden was telling Netanyahu that the killing of civilians, this targeting of civilians on this scale is embarrassing us. It's causing us. It's not nice. Doesn't look good for us, especially that there was an election happening or coming soon. And Netanyahu's response was that you guys did it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in Dresden, in Germany, elsewhere. So why are you coming after me right now? Like I'm a good student. I'm just repeating something that has been practiced before. So what? And you know that I need it, right? You guys needed it, so I need it. I need to do that. So why are you slowing me down? So Biden, according to his own narrative, claimed that no, we created this international legal system and these international institutions to stop this from happening, or to make sure it never happens again. That was according to the narrative of Biden. We don't know the exact. There might be a different narrative from Netanyahu if he speaks about it. So it comes to this, that everyone feels the need that international law should exist. International law, as a set of regime of laws, while it needs reformation, it does speak to the basic morality in a way or another. There are things that are disagreeable here and there, but like the very essence of it is to preserve the human and preserve life, preserve the beauty or the beautiful side of our existence. But the problem is that our interests, certain interests of some states, when they do not ally with international law, they will start looking for ways to either avoid international law or attack international law itself. And now what we're seeing, to conclude about this point, we don't see an attempt to avoid or evade obligations under international law. No, we are witnessing something that could be termed or coined into a new term that is emerging now called legicide, or the destruction of the very regime of laws, attacking the courts, like what you see, like the executive order, attacking the judges, and talking about the very existence of international law instead of saying that, no, no, I did not break the law. That was the Israeli argument all along. Oh, no, we did not break the law. Then this argument is not working anymore. Okay, the law is the problem. I think while we need to reform international law, we do need international law. But again, it's a vicious cycle. There's no way to give a straightforward answer to this question.
I know I didn't mean to push you into a corner there. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like one of those an existential problem that doesn't have an easy answer. And as one of the people that we've had on this show, who's a human rights lawyer, Armenian human rights specialist, talked about how you can't just wait for a genocider to stop; they have to be stopped. And so then the question becomes, how is that done? And does international law play a significant role in that? And I think that's kind of what everyone's wondering at this point. And with that, I know that you were at the Hague in the past couple of months, and I'm curious. I think a lot of people were really excited when the arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant was put out there. What now? Like, what is going on with this case or the cases against Israel? Is there any movement on that? And if there were any movement, what does that look like in terms of, realpolitik?
So, in short, the court issued the arrest warrants, which was what has been demanded all along from the court for a decade, for more than a decade. But at least since the war started, the pressing need became unavoidable. Yes, the warrants need to expand horizontally and vertically, as we said. Vertically in terms of the crimes that are mentioned, to include genocide, to include the different crimes against humanity and war crimes, including the settlements in the West Bank. There are different crimes that should be included in the mandate of the arrest warrants, and the arrest warrants should expand in terms of the people that are targeted. Like the chief of the Air Force is not there, while we know that the genocide was commissioned mainly through the Air Force. The chief of staff, other individuals who are directly involved in the genocide, who not only had the chance to halt it, but also directly willingly contributed to it. So that is expected of the court. We're asking the court to continue doing that. The court is potentially working on this at the moment. So in a nutshell, the court did what it can do. Issued arrest warrants. The court cannot go and arrest Netanyahu on its own. That's not what the ICC was designed for. It was on the basis of state collaboration. It takes us to the previous existential question about international law. States were expected to uphold the rule of law and their obligations, statutory obligations towards the Rome Statute and the ICC, and at least declare that they will cooperate. As they did, as many of them did very happily when the court issued arrest warrants against African leaders. So that was expected to be the same, right? It didn't, as you see. We started hearing of ancient international legal arguments under customary international law. I'm not trying to diminish the legality of these arguments, but I'm trying to highlight why they came out only now and never against Putin, never against any African head of state. So these customary international law was the same 2 years ago. And was the same 10 years ago when the arrest warrants, or 15 years ago, when the arrest warrants against Omar al-Bashir, who is a sitting president of a state, were issued. It's the same customary international. But all of a sudden, these arguments start coming from schools of law, coming all the way somehow finding their way into the foreign ministries, and then the foreign ministers will come out. And all of a sudden, you'll find these educated foreign ministers who know very well about customary international law to tell you that, oh, there is some complexity in arresting a head of state, a presiding head of state. All right, Yoav Gallant is not a head of state, and he's not a sitting defense minister. He was so arrest that at least. Okay, if not Netanyahu. So it's all about the cooperation of the states. If the states refuse to cooperate, nothing will happen. We know that the most visits of the prime minister of Israel and the defense minister of Israel does not. Usually Netanyahu's main visits are not to Africa, are not to Asia, are not to Latin America. Mostly they're either to Europe or North America, and mainly the United States, which means his flights would be flying over European territory, which is completely within the jurisdiction of the ICC. All of the countries that any flight from Netanyahu would pass by or would fly over would be within the jurisdiction of Italy, France, Spain, etc. So they are under obligation to request that flight to land on their own territory or prevent it from entering its own territory if let's say they're too hesitant to enforce their obligations or like to abide by their obligations. In reality, nobody wants to cooperate. It's like, I'm okay. Like Lindsey Graham was very kind to us and he just summarized the whole problem. Because we try to create theories, explain it, try to explain complicated points in simple terms. But then you have a senator coming out and telling you we created this court for African countries, for Asians, not for Germany, not for Israel, not for us. So this honesty is sometimes useful to summarize the problem that we have. I'm not trying to say that the ICC, I'm not trying to reduce the importance of the ICC. No, but I'm trying to highlight that there are states that want to employ the ICC in that way. The court is resisting that. Now the court has set a good, its intentions are in the right direction. It is suffering the consequences of this decision. So I think what should happen right now is that groups like the Hague Group and others should continue shielding the ICC, defending the ICC. If the ICC needs to move to another country to be protected, that might be a possibility, but it should not come to that. The Netherlands, that is a host to the ICJ as well, should protect the ICC as well.
Indeed, it should. And I hope the US doesn't invade it. But I mean, I feel like
it is harder to invade, to be honest. It is harder to invade The Hague than let's say another country. If let's say the ICC is relocated to Iraq or to Afghanistan or
right. I'm sure the US
to
would love
Egypt
that.
or to Egypt, I think the ICC will be in danger.
But I wouldn't put it past the US to just invade the Netherlands. I mean, the fall of the US empire is quite a TV show, and the writers are getting weird with it. So I want to talk a little bit in the time that we have left about the UN, because the US has, I mean, even before Trump came in, but now especially, has just basically, defecated on the whole concept of the United Nations. And I'm wondering, how is it that the US can still maintain its place in the UN, which is an incredibly powerful position that it holds there? How can it maintain its place there when it basically ignores the ICJ, when it completely defunds UNRWA and things like that? How can it maintain its place, and how can it be taken seriously by the UN when it completely, steamrolls over the entire concept of that body?
The US has a very good track in history of breaking international the resolutions of the United Nations and the judicial decisions coming from the ICJ. Nicaragua versus the United States of America, that happened in 1974, if I'm mistaken. Eh, 84, 70, 74, I think. Sorry. So the US clearly breached its obligations and rejected to cooperate with the court after it realized that the court is going after the government. This is not something new. In 2003, the US illegally invaded Iraq and opened the gates of hell in the Middle East that until now the Middle East is suffering from. ISIS came out of that, different things. So many consequences were directly connected to that illegal act. There was no accountability or no room for accountability. However, the difference between what was happening before and what's happening now is huge, in my opinion. Previously, the different US governments and administrations were trying to act conveniently, which means that they will break international law. So they follow their national interests while breaking international law, but in the same time trying to maintain these institutions. So the US did want these institutions to continue while breaking their obligations. So they wanted to be above the law, but they wanted the law to exist. However, what's happening right now, and we see a new precedent, is that there is a new understanding, emerging understanding within the new administration that, oh, why do we need the law? Like it's so much headache, you know? It's let's, let's make things more simple, which means that the very regime of international law could be dismantled. It's we're not just talking about military alignments, and we're not talking about we're not talking about NATO, we're not talking about trade relations, we're talking about the very idea of international law and the regimes, the institutions. Now, if the ICJ issues a new judgment against the US, like what happened in the Nicaragua versus the US in the previous century, if that happens today, would the US cut its funding to the UN and hence the ICJ? If that happens, that would lead to, I don't want to say the collapse of the organization, but the organization won't be able to perform its duty. Now, with the decision that happened against the ICC, the consequences are serious. The whole international financial system is connected to the US international financial system, which means will they be able still to use credit cards? The staff of they have their own daily life and daily responsibilities. They need to be connected with the financial system. Now, with these sanctions, what is going to happen? I'm not sure how severe the sanctions are yet because the order is fresh. So we need to see the details of it. So the difference between the defiance of international law before that, it has been always the case. The US did break international law regularly or use international law in different ways to break its to go against its essence. But the difference between what happened before and now is that there seems to be a new sense of why do we need even to defy international law? Let's get rid of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also curious with that financial aspect because we've had economists like Richard Wolff on the show, and people who are experts in the BRICS nations talking about how the U.S. is a waning power on the economic stage, and so I'd be curious to know like how nations like China and Russia and India and South Africa would be, if they would be willing to step up and keep the UN going, and then also, for instance, fund entities like UNRWA so that it's not dependent. I mean, the idea that an international legal like body is dependent upon the state that most frequently breaks international law feels ridiculous. It feels like it shouldn't be the case. And so I'd be very curious to know if that's something that like the BRICS nations are thinking about or working towards, because even as a child of empire myself, I think that the best thing for humanity is for people to leave the US empire to fall apart. So, um,
Let's hope there are better ways. I hope there are ways for reformation, and it's yeah. I mean, what's coming is not gonna look good at all. It doesn't seem to be very bright, but let's hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is not another train coming our way, as Slavoj Žižek puts it. So yeah, you know they say hope is a disease, but we need it. So
well, as one of my dear friends who was unfortunately passed on, indigenous anarchist Khalid Ben Ali once put it, I have the kind of hope that burns cop cars. So that's I have a very jagged and rugged and raw hope. So let it be the kind of hope that burns tanks. And Hassan, thank you so much for giving us this context and putting putting international law on the where it belongs, neither on a pedestal nor in a grave. So thank you again for coming on the show to do that.
thank you, Ilya. My pleasure.